At first glance, this is almost a picture of normal life. It's a London suburban high street emerging from lockdown after the government allowed a partial return to work in England this week. But for some, it's all too much, too soon.
What we're seeing already in London, at any rate, with the high densities of travel on the London Underground and on buses, should certainly give us cause for concern, because those are situations in which the transmission of the virus is very likely.
Professor MCKEE is part of an independent group of scientists and public health experts examining government policy on COVID-19. They've called parts of it dangerous, the easing of restrictions premature, and they question official messaging, like the new instruction to stay alert and use common sense about social distancing, rather than simply stay home.
To tell people that they need to use their common sense when we're dealing with a virus, a piece of RNA that most people are completely unfamiliar with in terms of the transmission, the dynamics and so on, is really quite problematic.
It's not just scientists who are worried. The care home sector remains in the grip of its deadly epidemic that has seen a quarter of all UK lives lost among society's most vulnerable people. And doctors and nurses on the healthcare front line are being told to brace for a second wave.
Doctors and nurses are absolutely exhausted. The first wave of this virus and this pandemic has drained us physically and emotionally, and the toll has been really huge. The prospect of going back to that, going back to where we were 8 weeks ago, is really, really horrifying, to be perfectly honest. The second thing that is really, again, incredibly worrying and anxiety-inducing for us on the front line is the lack of PPE. There's never been enough PPE. There wasn't enough first time round. If there's going to be a second spike, and it looks very much like there will be, there is definitely not enough PPE for healthcare workers in the country to be adequately protected.
The government insists it's following scientific advice and that a phased lifting of the lockdown depends on a falling infection rate. But the scientific and healthcare views I've been listening to are adamant there shouldn't be any lifting of the lockdown until test, trace and isolate mechanisms are in place to control future outbreaks. And they're not in place yet. And while research by Public Health England reveals that infections in the capital are down to just 24 a day, in the northeast of England the daily rate is still around 4,000. So a national strategy based on an average infection rate carries greater risk for some than for others, and could see good news turn bad very quickly. Jonah, Al Jazeera, London.